Welcome back, folks, and today I shall be discussing the Inquisition of Ahmad ibn Hanbal and the rise of the Ahlul Hadith movement. Now, in the last video, I discussed the rise of the Mu'tazila and how this sect of rational theology within the broader Sunni tradition brought about this kind of ultra rationalistic approach. As a counter reaction to this arose the Ahlul Hadith movement. Now, we couldn't quite say, or one can't quite say, that the Ahlul Hadith movement arose simply or only in response to the Mu'tazila movement, but a big part of the rise of this school was as a response to the Mu'tazila school. In opposition to the Mu'tazila movement, the Ahlul Hadith school arose. This was a traditionalist school in opposition to an ultra-rationalist school. The Ahlul Hadith movement, which stands for the people of the prophetic traditions, the Ahlul Hadith movement would mean in English the people of prophetic traditions. They are also referred to commonly as the Atharis, meaning those who follow the Athar, the reports from the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. And it also became synonymous with the Hanbali school of thought because the main spearhead and leader of this theological school is Ahmad ibn Hanbal himself. Originally, the name for the scholars who specialized in Hadith studies became synonymous with a strand of Sunni theology or a theological school within the Sunni strand, which placed importance on following the Sunnah, the prophetic traditions. Amongst their beliefs is the textual understanding of God's attributes. They also affirmed predestination alongside free will, that religious texts take precedence over the intellect, and that the Quran, the speech of God, is uncreated. This was in opposition to many of the ultra-rationalist sects, amongst them the Mu'tazila and their substrands, who said that the Quran, the speech of God, is created. Although this group has contributed much in terms of Hadith literature and represents a strand of Sunni orthodoxy, their attitude against employing rational theology has often been criticized and has often been viewed as anti-rationalist and fundamentalist in nature. It's important to note that the Ahlul Hadith strand does not reject the intellect or the use of rationality as a whole or completely. Rather, they would emphasize that religious texts take precedence over the intellect in understanding matters of religious creed, for example in matters of God's attributes and others. As such, we can understand that whilst those who would criticize them may view their anti-rationalist stance as problematic, they themselves would not perhaps view this as that much of a problem because they are ultimately following God's word. And perhaps the rational conclusion to be derived from their worldview is that since they are following God's words, then it is the most rational creed of all. The Mu'tazila's creed was adopted by the Abbasid caliphs for approximately 15 years, from 833 to 847 AD, as state religion. This led to the imposition of the doctrine of the createdness of the Quran by the Abbasid state. Many Ahlul Hadith scholars, out of fear of their lives, accepted this belief. However, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the famous Ahlul Hadith scholar, contested this. He was jailed and engaged in debates with major Mu'tazila scholars. Whilst he defended his beliefs, it went up to the extent that he was tortured and whipped and jailed. Eventually, Ibn Hanbal would be released. In the end, the Abbasids abandoned Mu'tazilism and the trial, the Mihna, ended after 15 years. It's also important to note here that the reason why the Mu'tazila fell out of favor, particularly within the broader mainstream Sunni world, is because of the kind of state repression that they committed over these few years during the time of the Inquisition. It left a bitter taste in the majority of the Sunni population and within the collective memory of Sunni Islamic scholarship, and hence the Mu'tazila began to fade into obscurity in its original form post this point. However, Ahmad ibn Hanbal would rise to fame and fortune, and his memory in the eyes of the collective conscious of the Sunnis would forever be enshrined as that of a figure who stood up for Sunni orthodoxy. The reality, of course, and the irony was that after this point, when the Hanbalites took power in the Abbasid Caliphate and especially in Baghdad, they did persecute many of the Mu'tazila. However, it's also important to note the context and backdrop in which all of these sort of persecutions and inquisitions did occur. It's unfortunate, of course, that this persecution of the Mu'tazila afterwards did occur, and it's also unfortunate that the earlier inquisition and persecution of the Ahlul Hadith scholars did occur. Of course, there's a bit of a blind spot, especially within the collective memory of the Sunnis, where they tend to forget the persecution that the Mu'tazila suffered as well. Most historians consider this inquisition, or the lack of its success against Ibn Hanbal, as a victory of traditionalist Islam over ultra-rationalist Sunni Islam. It forever enshrined Ibn Hanbal in the minds of Islamic scholarship as a heroic scholar who stood up for orthodoxy, and left a bitter taste regarding Mu'tazilism. Mu'tazilism as a Sunni school would cease to exist eventually. Its theology was eventually adopted by many Shia movements, such as the Twelvers and the Zaydis, and even the Ibadi movement in part, and has been revived partially within the Sunni world in the last 100 years. It's also important to note that the Western academy has taken a large interest in the Mu'tazila and in their views. Whilst of course it is understandable that they would appreciate the ultra-rationalist aspects, it's also important to know that they are often misportrayed in the Western academic circles as a ultrally liberal, tolerant, free-thinking sort of group. They weren't necessarily free thinkers, not at least in the way that we understand it. Whilst they were ultra-rationalists, they did in many cases advocate for the persecution of their opponents, as can be seen in the Inquisition of Ibn Hanbal. And furthermore, it must also be noted that they were very conservative in their jurisprudence, and in fact they were very practicing Muslims. In fact, they had a much more extreme position, for example, on sinful Muslims than normative Sunnis had.